morning, Warsaw! Today is Friday, 11th of August, and it will be cloudy with light rainfall, but with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:28 a.m. and sunset at 8:26 p.m. We are on the 11th day of the Warsaw Uprising. I hear that the goliath is used for the first time during the uprising. Roger will tell us more about it a little later. However, what else is happening during the uprising?
Thanks for that, Philippe. I think before we get to Roger and the Goliath, I think we've got to cover the old town first and the situation, because the bombing there and the conditions are just relentless, aren't they, Claire?
No, it's really ramped up. So 11th of August is really when the old town starts to suffer. So the old town of Warsaw, it's this beautiful warren of medieval streets and squares along the west bank of the Vistula. Absolutely stunning ancient city. It was completely destroyed. The Germans dropped over 1,500 tons of bombs over the old town specifically in just 2 weeks. And if you see photographs of the old town square, you may see a column in the central square. And then you'll know that those photos come from an earlier part of August, because that column gets bombed out in the end of August. Today, of course, that part of Warsaw, the old town, has been rebuilt because they kept the old plans, the old blueprints, and it's now actually a United Nations heritage site, because they've rebuilt it as it was. And you can see the column is up there again. It's actually a reproduction, because that original column still lies there where it fell on the side of the Royal Palace. So it's a replica that's there in place. But the entire part of the old town was decimated. So much that the Nazi Governor General told Hitler in a report he was delighted about. He said, for the most part, Warsaw is in flames. Burning down houses is the most reliable means of liquidating the insurgents' hideout. And Warsaw is going to be punished with complete destruction. And that's what happens at this point in the old town. Of course, it's not entirely lost, because the resistors are so active underneath the streets. And so Zofia Frano's groups of female sappers, their units of 5 women, are blasting through connecting cellar walls under the old town. And these passageways now, even aside from the routes in the cellars, are very significant. So they have connecting cellars that cross vast swathes of the city, and they give them names. Some of them, they've got rigged up electric lighting. The main thoroughfare was called General Sikorski Street, after the Polish leader, the former commander-in-chief. And so they are still fighting, not just living, but they're fighting from these readouts, from these hidden parts underneath the city. But they are now beginning to face even greater threats with new technology, new war equipment on the ground, aren't they? I mean, Roger, this is where they bring in the horrendous remote-controlled, the sort of mini-tanks, the Goliaths. Can you tell us a bit more about the equipment?
Yeah, Goliath's a really, really interesting sort of part of the story. It's one of those peculiarities of the German war machine. The Germans were remarkably sort of innovative in a lot of their military material that they produced in the war. I mean, it's one of those aspects that they produced so many different variants of various tanks, whereas the Soviets would produce one and produce, and keep producing them by the tens of thousands. One of the sort of faults of the German military industrial complex, if we can use that phrase, is that they sort of over specialized and had so many various versions of various things. And the Goliath, this sort of miniature tank, is one example of that sort of that huge variety that they produced. These were it looks like a miniature tank, effectively. It stands about 60 centimeters tall. It was about 90 centimeters in length. It weighed something like 400 kilograms. Looked, as I said, like a miniature tank, and it was basically a sort of what you might call a tracked mine. It'd be packed with about 60 kilograms of explosives, and it was operated by remote control. So it'd be set off initially with electric motors, later with two-stroke engines. but it was cabled, so it would run on a sort of a 100-meter cable, which would and it would be set off, and you could run it to up to an enemy-held building, for example, and then detonate it in front of the front wall, try and bring the wall down. Or in Warsaw, they're particularly useful against these barricades that we've been talking about a lot. So the Germans would sort of drive these tanks up, as we said, by remote control, up to the barricades and try and detonate them to destroy the barricades. Now, of course, from the Polish side, you had to try and knock out the Goliath before it got to you, which meant small arms fire, which meant, in many cases, it meant soldiers or even scouts running out to try and snip the wire, the control wire that ran between the German lines and the Goliath itself, which was an extremely hazardous thing to try and do. So it's a peculiarity, really, of the conflict in Warsaw. The Goliaths were seen elsewhere, not notably in the Siege of Breslau at the end of the war in 1945, but they're kind of synonymous with Warsaw because the urban conflict there and the barricades that we've described already in this podcast, sort of lent themselves to the use of this particular weapon. So it's quite a remarkable thing. It's really, you have to say, it's really the precursor of the drone when you think about it, which we're seeing now in Ukraine, with such to such effect. It's the precursor of that. It's remote control warfare. It's the debut of that phenomenon.
It's so interesting how they managed to actually defeat the Goliath. They captured one, and they got one of the prisoners of war, or the German prisoners of war, to take it apart and show them how exactly it functioned. And that's how they managed to work out the best way to be able to defeat them, rather than, for example, just throwing petrol bombs at it or shooting it with a Piat or wasting ammo, for example, because that's just catastrophic for the insurgents themselves, because they need to put that ammo into use rather than just wasting it on one Goliath, even though the damage would be very catastrophic if one of those did explode. We also have a really great testimony by Czesław Kęsner, who remembers how one of these Goliaths exploded and how they managed to try and defeat it.
When I was on the second floor, a woman came with her daughter, and they asked if they could be escorted to their apartment on the second floor, because they were being shot at through the windows. They wanted to find something, their private property, no one knows, but they had to be helped, because they were afraid to go in. I went with this woman, and there I taught them how to walk on all fours, close along the wall, slowly, so they couldn't be seen out of the window. During this lecture, I heard my brother's voice. He was in the bunker downstairs. He was shouting that a Goliath was coming. Then he shouted to me, "Run away, because a Goliath is coming." I stepped back and took this woman quickly to the stairs, and then there was an explosion. And this wall, where this woman wanted to see something there in their apartment, the wall fell. It was from this explosion. So this house is suddenly wide open. There's no wall. Well, a lot of ruins have fallen there, and you can easily jump into the house, which means the Germans can attack us. We had one pistol from the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, and there are 3 bullets for it. Other ammunition didn't fit in because it was so old. 3 bullets that won't stop the Germans' attack. We had built a bunker with gates. You could leave through the gates. It was made out of the sandbags and covered with netting so that the Germans wouldn't be able to throw a grenade, but the explosion of the Goliath blew it off. And the gate fell. My brother defended the entrance to the house with 1 pistol, but because another Goliath was flying, my brother called me. I came running. "What are we doing? We have nothing to..." "I will stop him." I took a grenade, jumped in front of the collapsed wall and looked. A Goliath was coming from the opposite direction. When the Goliath was leaving, the gate was open on the opposite side. I threw a grenade onto the pavement. The Goliath drove on the top of the gate. It drove on, drove over it. I was lying down. I threw myself onto the ground and covered my head. I was lying down, waiting, counting, 5 seconds, and there was no explosion. 9, 10, maybe more. The Goliath had already reached the middle of the street. It was about a meter or 2 in front of me, and there was an explosion. I covered my head. But it was not the explosion of the Goliath, but the explosion of my grenade. The Goliath was still working, but it was not moving. The engine was working, but its chains were not working. The tank was standing, And what? It exploded at any moment. I ran to my brother and said, "Do you know what you did?" Because he was watching it. "You tore off the wires that ran this goliath, and it stopped. Where the explosion was, it stopped. And now it can explode because it must have a wire to explode. We're hiding, but how can you hide behind a piece of wall, part of which has already fallen?"
Of course, the Poles have great form on reverse engineering like that. I mean, they were doing that with machine guns. They created their own kind of weaponry like that. So yeah, they've got great form in reverse engineering and then working out how to develop this themselves. And of course, when they did capture the Goliath, they are recycling, very environmental. They're recycling all of the weapons on it as well, reusing the explosives in their own groups. But I mean, yeah, like you said, I mean, it seems like it'd be not that hard with this remote controlled weapon to go out and snip the cable that connects it. But of course, behind the walls, behind the lines, there are all the German snipers just waiting to go and get you. So, I mean, often there were people undertaking great personal sacrifice to try and prevent these machines from actually reaching the barricades. Of course, the Poles did have one tank. I mean, it's another example of recycling. It was a German tank that they captured. I think we mentioned it earlier, Magda, and she comes into use here, doesn't she? Who wants to take us up on that?
I'll jump on that actually. We always love talking about Magda because she's, the insurgents captured tanks. This is amazing in itself that they managed to do that. But Magda, she's the only one that's really left. The others have been destroyed. She supports more or less the attacks of various groups. For example, the Radosław group. They managed to regain a certain district up. They managed to get one of the major streets, Stawki, up slightly in the northern part of the city, which is a major connection between Wola and the old town. But the problem is that she's still needed because in other parts of the city, because in other parts of that district, because other parts of that area, the situation is quite critical because the Germans are quite heavily concentrating their forces in that area. Some of the headquarters had to be abandoned because they were stormed by the Germans. And basically, I mean, this is a bit of a sad moment for Magda because the battery conked out. It was exhausted. And then Magda was set on fire by the insurgents. But the problem here is the fire went out. The problem being here is the fire went out and they kept attempting to reignite her and they were unsuccessful. And then the Germans took her back because she wasn't burnt and she had minor damage on her, which is a bit sad in itself, really. A sad ending to Magda. She switched hands from the Germans to the insurgents and back to the Germans again. So the Germans have Magda. What else are they up to, Roger?
Well, one of the most significant developments on this day is that Kamiński of the Kamiński Brigade is sort of brought to heel by the Germans. You'll remember that the Kamiński Brigade, which was made up of, I think to a large extent, Belarusian, but also Russian turncoats, who had renegades, who had just opted to serve the Germans, and had sort of cut a swathe through the suburbs of western and southwestern Warsaw, committing, countless atrocities in the process. And those atrocities obviously were considered, too rich even for the SS in Warsaw. So he was called to German headquarters and called to account for himself. And the discussion that was had there at German headquarters is quite notable because Kamiński basically defends himself by saying that his people and himself, of course, they've been forced from their homes, they'd lost everything, they had nothing to show for anything that they'd done or that for their lives, for their service. And he says they had been promised a free hand in Warsaw to do as they pleased, essentially in compensation for everything that they'd lost in their long years of service for the Germans. The German response to that, of course, was that that what he was doing was damaging for German morale. They didn't particularly care for the fate of the Poles, but was damaging for German morale to some extent. But that didn't cut much ice. And eventually they realised that Kaminsky had to be put in his place. There's a wonderful image which is given by one of those officers present at the time. It says that Kaminsky returned to Warsaw initially, but he didn't change his ways. And one soldier remembered him sitting on the balcony of his headquarters with a bottle of vodka in one hand and with two women on his knee. And that rather sums up, how the Kaminsky Brigade tended to operate. Its men were almost permanently drunk and tended to see women particularly as expendable war booty. Eventually he would be removed from Warsaw, but this is the first moment where Kaminsky, the tide is turning against this the brutality of these units.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 11. Please come back tomorrow for day 12. And don't forget, if you did like this podcast, please do give us a 5-star rating. It allows us to reach a wider audience.